One kind of thing that we all know about phonetics and phonology is that whatever kind of abstract representation we give to a sound differs quite a bit from what we actually say. So if we start, we can represent some sounds with things like IPA symbols in a very broad transcription, like this word activity. And we can even add some more detail by, for example, reducing vowels, adding aspiration onto the stop, flapping. But even that level of detail gets nothing close to this, which is what we actually say and produce. And so my general area of interest is how we deal with the difference between the surface forms and the abstract representations, particularly when it comes to segmental complexity. So some sequences of sounds we typically analyze as segments, whereas others we typically analyze as sequences. And I think the best known example of this is with nasal stop sequences. So in languages like Fijian, nasal stop sequences like MB are typically considered to be single segments. But if you have kind of what looks very similar on the surface in English, a nasal stop sequence like in humbug, you would never posit that to be a single segment. It's pretty clearly two consonants that just happen to be adjacent. So we actually have a similar situation when we come to combinations of things that are stops plus H. So for example, in the English word tip, the typical analysis is that the t at the beginning is an aspirated stop, not a juxtaposition of a t plus an h. But there are actually languages where this is not the case, where these sequences are instead analyzed, sequences instead are analyzed as clusters. So for example, in Old Khmer, there's pretty good evidence that an onset K plus H sequence is actually a sequence, specifically because these can be split by things like infixes. So the question then becomes, is if we have forms that are very similar on the surface, at least when you look kind of at the broad level, how can you tell what the representations are? And so today I'll be telling you about two experimental tasks. One is a perception task, and one is new acoustic data that's very much preliminary at this point, that focuses on an ongoing change in Sevillian Spanish. So the case study and what's the interest of the change in Sevillian Spanish is that there's a sound change that I refer to as metathesis, and it starts with something that's actually very common across probably the majority of Spanish varieties, which is debuccalization of coda S to H. So a word like chispa is produced as chispa, and you end up with this H plus a stop. The part that's specific to Sevillian and nearby varieties is the metathesis. So you actually get flipping of the P and the H, of the H and the P to PH. So chispa becomes chipa. And so if we assume that the underlying representation has not changed, then the metathesis is quite a divergence from the underlying representation. But I think we also need to take into the account here that there is a possibility that the representation has changed, specifically because these metathesized forms look a whole lot like aspirated stops in languages like English. And to show you what this looks like acoustically, on the left, I don't know if it's your left, well, that side, you have an intervocalic k, and on the other side you have the realization of an S-k cluster. And in both of them you have the stop closure, but then where they differ is in the release phase. So the intervocalic one has a very small release phase, which is typical of unaspirated stops, and the SK cluster has a very long release phase. And the other thing you'll notice about this token is that there's basically none of the H that stayed in the original location. It's kind of entirely moved to afterwards. And I can play these for you. Here's the intervocalic one.
Fracaso.
And the SC.
Cascada. Cascada.
Okay, so you can hear the kada part, right? And if you look at English aspirated stops, just visually, impressionistically, they look a lot like this, with the stop closure plus a very long release. So the issue here is that the stop H sequences on the surface are representationally ambiguous. They, on one hand, could be realizations of aspirated stops, but on the other hand, they could just be surface realizations of underlying clusters. And in this case, the underlying cluster would still be the SP or SK or whatever, and the metathesized version is just one allophone of it. And I'll tell you right now to foreshadow that this is very clearly the analysis that all of the experimental results point towards. Okay, so I'm going to start with the perception experiment. And this task asked broadly, what is the representational statuses of these sequences in Sevillian? And the way I went about this was to design a task that basically forced Sevillians to treat the stop and the H as separable, to see if they would do it. And I did this by using the morphological distinction between third singular verbs, so tiene, which do not have an underlying S, versus second singular verbs, which do have an underlying S, so tienes. And the task looked like this. So listeners basically heard, so Spanish is pro-drop, you can leave out the subject. So I bleeped out the subject of these sentences, gave them an ambiguous verb, tiene, and then stuck a nonce word after it, like cali, and manipulated the duration of the release of cali. And the question they were asked was, who is the subject of this sentence? And the idea is that if they are kind of separating the stop and the H and they're mapping it to an underlying S-stop cluster, then the longer you make the H, the more likely they should be to kind of undo the metathesis, put the S on the verb, which would then affect their choice of subject. Whereas in contrast, when there's a short H or no H, they should give you more no S responses, or subjects that correspond to the no S verb form. And in contrast, if they're treating the stop H as a single segment, they shouldn't be doing any of that, and you should get no difference based on the duration or presence of H. Okay, so this is what the results look like. On the x-axis, you have the duration of H from 0 being short to 2 being the longest, and the y-axis is the proportion response, and the black line will be the no S subject, and the gray dotted is the S full subject. So this is what happened. Basically, what this shows you is that when H is short, so over here at 0, they're giving you almost entirely Juan subjects, so subjects that correspond to the verb form that has no S on it. Whereas when you give them a long H, they're giving you almost entirely second singular subjects. So what this seems to suggest is that these listeners are taking the C and the H, and they're treating the H as a separable unit that they're mapping back to belonging to the verb. And I ran a group of Mexican Spanish speakers as well for a comparison point, and very briefly, they did not do the task. I can talk more about that later if you would like. Okay, so if we've established that the underlying representation in Sevillian Spanish of these stop H sequences is actually still an S-stop cluster, then that raises the question of, okay, so what cues are there for the segmental status of these stop H sequences, specifically maybe in comparison to aspirated stops in other languages? And I think this is an interesting question because if we are going to, we as linguists or learners, if we're going to posit an analytical difference between these derived stop H sequences and an aspirated stop, then that difference must be learnable somehow. And the difference between segments and sequences, there have been a lot of proposals about how learners might learn this. Most of them, well, some of them computationally implemented, but some methods include you can learn them maybe by phonotactics, potentially by statistical distributions or frequencies of sounds. And the evidence using phonetics is quite mixed, and I will say that most of this work uses durational measurement. So for example, measuring the components of different durations to try to distinguish whether, for example, the nasal stop is a sequence or a cluster. But there is another way to go about this phonetically, I think. And so this is where my interest in the phonetics comes in. So we also know that segments and sequences have been found to differ in both gestural coordination and cohesion. And there's a couple ways this could play out with these stop H sequences and aspirated stops. So one potential way is that there might be different timing of the laryngeal gesture, right? So in aspirated stops, it's plausible that the laryngeal gesture might occur earlier, and so its peak might be differently timed with regard to the release of the stop. And if this is true, then we might expect differences in both kind of fine phonetic detail of the stop release, and also maybe in how the co-articulation works with the surrounding vowels. It's also been found that gestures in clusters tend to have lower cohesion than gestures in segments. So whereas gestures in segments might be very kind of closely, stably timed with each other, two adjacent sounds, the timing might be more variable. And if this is the case, then we could expect high variability in the timing of the laryngeal gesture around the stop closure. And finally, there's a difference in featural specification. So aspirated stops, as we just heard, are typically thought of as having a contrastive spread glottis feature. And typically, when you put these in prosodically strong positions, in languages like English, German, there's enhancement of the spread glottis feature, either in duration or in specific spectral properties of the release. And the idea is that that's because you're trying to enhance a contrastive feature in most cases. So I think these derived stop-H sequences, there's quite a fair chance that they will differ from aspirated stops in how they respond when you put them in prosodically strong positions, because there's no sense in which the H or the spread glottis actually belongs to the stop. So like I said, this is very preliminary work. And so the first goal is to do a pretty detailed phonetic description of what these derived aspirated stops actually look like and what we can get from the acoustic data about co-articulation with surrounding segments. So recently, as in the past month or two, I've collected a bunch of data from 35 speakers in Seville, basically target words in carrier sentences, and all you need to know about them is that they were arranged in very carefully controlled pairs, so that you were comparing an ata to an asta, ata, and also affricates and puta. And today I'll just show you some data from 5 speakers. So what I need to, and I forgot to mention, I'm going to focus on the laryngeal alignment for this little piece. So what I haven't told you yet is that the typical description of metathesis is articulatory. So typically the way this is described as happening is that in the unmetathesized form, so when H is still before the stop, you have a closure gesture that's aligned kind of in the middle of a wide glottal gesture. And in the acoustics, what this gives you is H followed by a stop and a very short release. And the hypothesis from the metathesized forms is that basically you get realignment of the closure gesture so that almost the entirety of the glottal gesture is realized after the stop, which leads to acoustically a long release. So metathesis has been reported to be complete in the majority of cases, and split forms are reported, but they're pretty rare. And by split forms, what I mean is that if you have this realignment, you can get forms where kind of it's partial. So you have some H sticking out before and some after. But I'm a little suspicious of the low quantity of these split forms, specifically because I think there's probably more evidence that has not been captured in previous analyses that the acoustics actually do show that this stop H is derived. And the reason I'm suspicious is because H is very, very hard to measure, especially when you try to put segmental boundaries around it. So the proposal here is to look actually at a gradient measure of voice quality over the interval both preceding and following the stop to try to get rid of that issue. And so what I'm showing you here is a plot of CPP. All you need to know about this is that when this measure is lower, it typically means less modal, and in this case, higher breathiness. And the intervocalic words are the red lines, and the SC clusters are the blue lines, and 5 speakers in the vertical facets. And so what you see is that starting pretty early, especially for the last 2 speakers, in the preceding vowel, you actually get quite a bit of breathiness. And this is breathiness that's not always segmentable, right? So sometimes it extends over the vowel, and you can't put boundaries around it. And you'll also notice that for a lot of the speakers, this breathiness extends substantially into the following vowel in ways that is not captured if you were just to try to mark a VOT measurement. So I think looking at voice quality on the first vowel, pre-stop, suggests that this metathesis is not as complete as we typically assume, and that this may be one piece of phonetic evidence against an aspirated stop representation if you're a learner. Furthermore, the extensive carryover breathiness, which hasn't been reported before, typically is discussed in relation to breathy voice stops in Indic languages, but never in relation to this. And so I think, looking more broadly, variability in laryngeal timing might actually be able to tie together things that are extraordinarily representationally different. So for example, breathy stops, pre and post aspiration on stops, and also metathesis. And finally, the immediate future involves looking really closely at the effects of linguistic conditioning factors on the metathesis, and also finding kind of a coherent way to quantify variability in laryngeal timing. And I think the broader questions here involve looking at the relationship between status and aspiration of variability, timing of it, and actually trying to use this variability to contribute to our understanding of representations rather than just seeing them as something that complicates the analysis. And I will stop there.